The courthouse buzzed with energy as reporters scrambled for the best spots outside. A high-profile case had brought the city's elite to its knees. At the center of it all was Marshall Dalton, a billionaire real estate mogul known for his sharp suits, flashy cars, and unshakable confidence. Today, however, his name was making headlines for an entirely different reason. Dalton stepped out of his sleek black limousine with a cold, almost bored expression. His eyes shielded by dark sunglasses, he didn't even glance at the cameras or take a moment to acknowledge the crowd. His bodyguard walked a few steps ahead, clearing a path for him as he made his way toward the entrance of the courthouse. The sound of reporters calling his name, trying to get a word from him, was drowned out by the click of his polished shoes on the pavement. Inside the courtroom, the air was tense. Everyone knew this wasn't just any case. Judge Nella Harrison, a woman who had earned her reputation for being one of the most respected judges in the city, was presiding over the trial. At the age of 42, she was both feared and admired. No one dared to challenge her decisions, but everyone knew that she played by the rules. Unlike others in the courtroom, Judge Harrison didn't need to prove her power. Her presence alone was enough to command respect. As Dalton strode into the room, all eyes turned to him, watching as he made his way to the front row. The judge had just entered, her heels clicking softly as she made her way to the bench. The room stood up in unison, an unspoken tradition whenever a judge entered the room. Everyone, that is, except for Marshall Dalton. He didn't budge. He sat there, leaning back in his chair, checking his phone. It was as though he didn't notice the whole room rise or the judge standing there, waiting for the moment of acknowledgement. There was an awkward silence. Judge Harrison didn't react immediately. She simply stood there, her gaze unwavering. The tension in the room was thick, almost suffocating. Everyone watched, waiting to see how she would respond. But Judge Harrison's calm demeanor gave nothing away. She simply waited. After what felt like an eternity, she spoke, her voice smooth and even. "Mr. Dalton," she said, "is there a reason you are not standing?" The words hung in the air, and for a split second, it seemed like the entire room held its breath. Marshall Dalton finally lowered his phone, glanced up at her, and then slowly looked around the room as if to say, "What's the big deal?" With a slight smirk on his face, he simply shrugged. "I don't stand for anyone unless I respect them," he said, his voice casual, almost dismissive. Judge Harrison's expression didn't change. She remained calm, her eyes never leaving his. "Noted," she replied quietly. And with that, she signaled for the court proceedings to begin. But it was clear that something had shifted. The respect that everyone had expected in the courtroom was now in question. Marshall Dalton, with his wealth and power, had made a statement that no one could ignore. He had refused to show respect for the judge, and in doing so, he had drawn a line in the sand. But Judge Harrison wasn't the kind of person to let that slide, not without a response. The trial continued, but everyone could feel the shift in the air. As Marshall sat there, seemingly unfazed, Judge Harrison was already planning her next move. She wasn't going to let this moment define her or her courtroom. If anything, it had only made her more determined to show him, and everyone else, that respect wasn't something that could be demanded with arrogance or wealth. It was earned. As the trial got underway, Marshall Dalton may have thought he had won a small victory by defying the judge. But little did he know, his arrogance had set the stage for something much bigger. The silence in the courtroom felt like it could swallow everyone whole. Marshall Dalton, sitting smugly in his seat, had just made a bold statement by refusing to stand for Judge Nella Harrison. The tension in the room was palpable. It wasn't just about a simple lack of courtesy. It was a challenge, a direct attack on authority. And yet, the judge remained calm, composed, almost too calm. She didn't let his defiance rattle her. In fact, she had already made up her mind about how this trial was going to go. Judge Harrison, with her years of experience, knew that Marshall Dalton was no ordinary defendant. The billionaire was used to getting what he wanted: power, money, influence. He had it all, and he had always used these tools to control every situation he was in. But this time, in her courtroom, things were different. She wasn't about to let anyone, no matter how wealthy or influential, disrupt the integrity of the law. As the proceedings continued, Marshall sat back, still not standing, his legs casually crossed as he watched the judge. His smirk didn't fade. In fact, he seemed to enjoy the discomfort he was causing. Every once in a while, he would glance around the room, meeting the eyes of the other attorneys and witnesses, silently daring them to challenge him. But Judge Harrison didn't flinch. She proceeded with the case as though nothing had happened, her voice steady as she asked the first question. Marshall's attorney, a sharp-eyed man named Alexander Bennett, stood up to begin the defense. His words were measured, his arguments carefully crafted. He knew that Dalton's money and reputation would be their best defense. But in the back of his mind, he had to be wondering, had they underestimated the judge? Did they really think they could push around someone like Nyla Harrison? As the trial moved forward, Marshall's behavior became even more noticeable. He started to grow more agitated as Judge Harrison picked apart his statements. She asked questions that dug deeper than he was comfortable with, forcing him to stutter over his words. Every time he tried to shift the blame, Judge Harrison was there, ready to point out the holes in his story. Her calm, measured approach contrasted sharply with Marshall's arrogance, and the more he tried to maintain control, the more he seemed to lose it. During one of the cross-examinations, Marshall made a careless remark. He tried to downplay the evidence of his shady business deals, dismissing it with a wave of his hand. "It's all just a misunderstanding," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "This is all just some conspiracy to bring me down because of my success." Judge Harrison didn't flinch. Instead, she calmly looked over at the prosecution and nodded for them to present the next piece of evidence. The courtroom held its breath as a video played on the large screen behind her. It showed Marshall Dalton in a private meeting, discussing a land deal with city officials. The words bribe and illegal were spoken clearly, and everyone in the room saw the uncomfortable truth. Marshall's face drained of color as the evidence was presented, but it was too late to take it back. The room was electric with murmurs as the video ended. Marshall's smug demeanor faltered for the first time since the trial began. He shifted in his seat, suddenly looking uneasy. Judge Harrison, however, was as calm as ever. She glanced over at him briefly, her eyes hard, and then turned back to the proceedings without saying a word. Marshall's legal team whispered among themselves, clearly caught off guard. They had been banking on the idea that Marshall's wealth and influence could buy his way out of this. But now, they were realizing something. This wasn't going to be like any other case they'd handled before. Judge Harrison wasn't just any judge. She wasn't going to bend to pressure. She wasn't going to allow a billionaire's arrogance to ruin the integrity of the court. As the trial continued, Marshall seemed to shrink into his seat, no longer the confident billionaire he had once been. For the first time, he was on the defensive, struggling to maintain his composure. And Judge Harrison, with a quiet, unshakable strength, was in complete control of the room. The courtroom may have been full of powerful people, but today, power had a new definition. And Marshall was about to find out just how powerful it could be when the law was the one holding the reins. The courtroom was tense, the weight of the previous day's events still hanging in the air. Marshall Dalton, though he tried to appear unbothered, had visibly shrunk in the face of the evidence. But the worst part for him wasn't the video or the courtroom's whispers. It was the fact that Judge Nyla Harrison hadn't flinched, hadn't shown an ounce of emotion. She had maintained her calm, measured demeanor the entire time, and that was something he hadn't expected. As the second day of the trial began, Marshall was sitting in the same spot as before, his posture more rigid, his eyes darting around the room. The once confident billionaire was now on edge. He could feel the weight of everyone's gaze on him, but none more so than the judge's. Judge Harrison's steady, calm eyes seemed to pierce through him, as if she could see right into his every move. The prosecution continued to build its case, and every argument they presented seemed to be more damning than the last. Marshall's defense team tried their best to counter, but it was clear that they were struggling to keep up. Each time they made a point, Judge Harrison was quick to dismantle it with one simple question or a remark that left the defense team scrambling. Marshall's frustration grew with each passing minute. He shifted in his seat, tapping his fingers against the wooden armrest, but nothing seemed to help. The more he tried to take control of the situation, the more he realized that he was losing grip. The courtroom, once his domain, now felt like a place where he had no power. But it wasn't just the pressure from the evidence that was getting to him. It was the way Judge Harrison conducted herself. She wasn't like any judge he had ever faced. She didn't need to raise her voice or show anger to make a point. Her silence was often louder than any words, and it was starting to get under Marshall's skin. He was used to being the one who intimidated others, not the other way around. As the morning session wore on, Marshall's patience began to wear thin. He leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the table, and shot a look toward Judge Harrison. The cold stare she returned was like a challenge. He couldn't decide if he was angry or impressed. But one thing was certain, she wasn't going to let him walk all over her. Then, in a rare moment of vulnerability, Marshall spoke. His voice was quieter than usual, but there was an edge to it. "You're not going to let me win, are you?" he asked, his words dripping with frustration. Judge Harrison's gaze didn't waver. "This isn't about winning, Mr. Dalton," she replied, her voice calm, but firm. "This is about justice, and it doesn't matter who you are or how much money you have. The law is the law." Marshall didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked away, his jaw tightening. For a moment, it almost seemed like he was going to snap, but he didn't. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He was used to being the one in control, and the fact that he was losing that grip was eating at him. But Judge Harrison didn't give him a moment to gather himself. She moved on, seamlessly transitioning to the next part of the trial. The courtroom was quiet except for her steady voice as she questioned the next witness. Marshall's eyes remained fixed on her, but his thoughts were a whirlwind. This wasn't just a legal battle anymore. It had become something more personal. He had tried to push her, to make her bend, and she hadn't given him an inch. By the time the lunch break arrived, Marshall was restless. He stood up quickly, not even sparing a glance at anyone as he made his way out of the courtroom. But before he could reach the door, he paused and turned back. Judge Harrison was still sitting at the bench, calmly reviewing some papers. There was something about her composure that both frustrated and fascinated him. It was clear that she wasn't intimidated, not by him, not by anyone. And that, more than anything, bothered him. As Marshall left the room, the doors closing behind him, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a fight for his freedom. It was a battle for respect, for power, and for control. But for the first time, he wasn't the one calling the shots, and somehow that thought felt more unsettling than anything else. The second day of the trial had ended, but the tension in the courtroom seemed to linger in the air. Marshall Dalton was starting to feel the weight of the situation. He had expected to walk into court, make a few clever remarks, and walk out victorious. But instead, he was facing a challenge unlike any he had ever encountered before. Judge Nella Harrison wasn't backing down. She wasn't intimidated by his wealth or his reputation, and that made her the most dangerous opponent he had ever faced. As the third day of the trial began, it became clear that the momentum had shifted. Marshall's defense team was scrambling, trying to come up with ways to discredit the evidence the prosecution had presented. But no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't shake the weight of the video that had been played for the jury. Marshall's bribes, his shady land deals, it was all there, clear as day. And Judge Harrison wasn't letting any of it slide. Throughout the morning, the prosecution continued to dig deeper, presenting witness after witness who confirmed Marshall's involvement in illegal activities. Each piece of evidence was like a hammer, chipping away at his defense, and yet Marshall remained seated, still refusing to show respect to the judge or the court. He had believed that his money could buy him out of anything, But it was becoming painfully clear that it wasn't going to work this time. The turning point came when a former business associate of Marshall's took the stand. She was nervous, clearly intimidated by the thought of testifying against him. But when she started speaking, the truth came pouring out. She explained how Marshall had forced her into signing documents that covered up illegal land transactions. She spoke of the threats, the pressure, the fear of losing everything if she didn't comply. Marshall sat back in his chair, his face pale, his fingers tapping on the table. He didn't even look at the witness as she spoke. But Judge Harrison was paying close attention, her eyes locked on the witness as she carefully took notes. It was clear that this testimony was going to be a crucial turning point in the case. When the witness finished, the room fell silent. Marshall's attorney, Alexander Bennett, stood up quickly, trying to regain control of the situation. He made an attempt to discredit the witness, suggesting that she had an agenda and was only trying to save herself. But Judge Harrison wasn't buying it. She interrupted him, her voice calm but firm. "Mr. Bennett," she said, "this is not a trial for character assassination. This is about the truth. And the truth is, your client is in deep trouble." The words hit Marshall like a ton of bricks. For the first time in the trial, he couldn't pretend that things were going his way. Judge Harrison wasn't allowing any of his usual tricks to work. He had tried to ignore her, to dismiss her as just another figurehead in the courtroom. But now he realized that she was in full control, and he was powerless against her. As the day wore on, the case against Marshall continued to build. The prosecution presented more evidence, each piece stronger than the last. Witnesses came forward, and they were all consistent in their testimony. Marshall's empire, built on years of shady dealings and corruption, was crumbling in front of him. He could feel the walls closing in. But the most striking part of the day wasn't the evidence or the witnesses. It was the way Judge Harrison conducted herself. She never raised her voice, never seemed flustered. She was always calm, always in control. Every decision she made was calculated, deliberate. She wasn't letting Marshall's arrogance rattle her. If anything, it seemed to make her more determined to see justice done. By the time the court session ended, Marshall was a shell of the confident billionaire who had walked in just days before. He had tried to remain in control, to bully his way through the trial. But now it was clear to everyone that he was losing. The defense team gathered in hushed whispers, trying to figure out how they could salvage the case. But it was becoming increasingly clear that there was no easy way out for Marshall Dalton. Judge Harrison had proven that the law was more powerful than his money. And now, the entire courtroom was watching as his empire started to collapse. Marshall Dalton had always been the one in charge. He was used to making the rules, not following them. But as the trial entered its fourth day, it was clear that the tables had turned. Judge Nella Harrison was no longer just another figure in a courtroom. She was the one calling the shots, and Marshall could no longer escape the consequences of his actions. As the morning session began, Marshall felt the weight of the situation more than ever. His defense team, once confident and determined, had begun to show signs of cracking under the pressure. Their arguments were getting weaker, their attempts to discredit the witnesses falling flat. The prosecution, on the other hand, seemed more prepared than ever. They had gathered more evidence, and with each new piece, Marshall's world seemed to crumble a little bit more. Marshall sat in his usual spot, arms crossed, his eyes fixed on the floor. He wasn't looking at the judge, the jury, or even his own defense team. Instead, his mind was racing. He had tried everything: bribing, intimidating, manipulating, but nothing was working. No amount of money or influence could change the truth that was staring him in the face. Then, a new witness took the stand. It was a former employee of one of Marshall's companies, someone who had once been loyal to him, but had turned against him after discovering the corruption within the business. The witness spoke calmly but firmly, detailing the shady deals that had been going on behind closed doors. They described how Marshall had used his wealth and power to push through illegal transactions, all while silencing anyone who dared to speak out. Marshall's fingers tightened on the edge of his chair. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, and for the first time in this trial, he was scared. This witness had no reason to lie, and as their testimony continued, the evidence against Marshall grew more overwhelming. The prosecution was winning, and Marshall knew it. But it wasn't just the testimony that was shaking him. It was the way Judge Harrison was handling the case. She wasn't making a big spectacle out of anything. She wasn't raising her voice or trying to outsmart anyone. Instead, she was simply letting the facts speak for themselves. And as the facts piled up, Marshall's defense started to look more and more like a lost cause. Marshall's attorney, Alexander Bennett, tried to mount a defense, but his arguments were losing their strength. Every time he attempted to challenge a piece of evidence, Judge Harrison was quick to shut him down, pointing out the flaws in his reasoning. It was like watching a skilled chess player dismantle an opponent, one move at a time. And Marshall, for the first time, was the one getting checkmated. The room was quiet as the witness finished their testimony. Marshall looked around the courtroom, his eyes darting from the judge to the jury, then back to the defense team. The weight of it all was pressing down on him. His once unshakable confidence had faded, replaced by the dawning realization that he was losing. And losing badly. Judge Harrison didn't need to say anything to make it clear. Her calm demeanor, the way she was quietly taking notes as the witness spoke, sent a message louder than any words could. She wasn't just ruling the court. She was dismantling Marshall's empire, piece by piece. As the session broke for lunch, Marshall stood up slowly, his mind clouded with frustration. He walked out of the courtroom without looking at anyone, his steps heavy, his thoughts consumed by the thought that his once untouchable world was crumbling around him. Outside the courthouse, reporters were still gathered, waiting for any sort of statement from him. Marshall ignored them, his usual confidence replaced by something else. Uncertainty. He had always believed that money could buy him anything. But in that courtroom, it had become painfully clear that some things could not be bought. And now he was facing the consequences of his own arrogance. The trial wasn't over yet, but Marshall could feel the end drawing closer. The question wasn't whether he would lose. It was how much he would lose, and how badly. Judge Harrison had proven that she wasn't interested in his wealth or status. She was interested in one thing, the truth. And for Marshall Dalton, that truth was more dangerous than anything else he had ever faced. The courtroom was quieter than usual as the sixth day of the trial began. It wasn't the kind of quiet that felt calm. It was the heavy kind. The kind that made everyone feel like something big was about to happen. Marshall Dalton walked in slower than before, his shoulders hunched just a little. The arrogant smirk he once wore was long gone. Now his face looked tired, like someone who hadn't slept in days. He didn't look at the judge as he took his seat. Judge Nella Harrison was already there, sitting tall and calm, flipping through her notes. She didn't seem bothered by the tension in the room. In fact, she looked exactly the same as she had on the first day, focused, patient, and in control. The prosecution started by introducing a new piece of evidence. It was an email exchange, one that clearly showed Marshall approving an illegal land grab. His signature was at the bottom. It was short, but powerful, and once it was read out loud, the whole room seemed to shift. Even the jury members leaned forward, clearly paying extra attention. Marshall didn't react. He just stared ahead, his jaw clenched. His lawyer tried to object, but Judge Harrison quickly overruled him. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. Her words were sharp and clear. "This evidence is relevant and will be allowed," she said simply. It was only a few words, but they made Marshall's heart sink. After the email was discussed, something unexpected happened. Judge Harrison called for a short break, but instead of leaving the courtroom right away, she stood and addressed everyone. "Before we continue," she said, "I'd like to remind this court that justice doesn't favor the powerful. It doesn't bow to money or fame. It listens to the truth." She looked straight at Marshall as she spoke those last words. And for the first time, he looked back. Not with defiance, not with arrogance, but with something else. Confusion, maybe even shame. He wasn't used to people standing up to him. Not like this. And especially not in front of a room full of people. The short break gave everyone a moment to breathe. Some reporters whispered to each other, scribbling down notes. A few people in the audience quietly exchanged looks. They all felt it. Something was changing. Marshall was no longer the untouchable billionaire. He was just a man, sitting on trial, with his lies catching up to him. After the break, the courtroom filled again. This time, a new witness was called. An accountant who used to work under Marshall. He had brought files, numbers, and years of hidden financial details. He spoke clearly and confidently, explaining how Marshall had used shell companies and fake accounts to hide illegal earnings. The jury listened closely. Every new document was another nail in the coffin. Marshall leaned back in his chair, rubbing his forehead. He didn't argue anymore. He didn't even whisper to his lawyer. He just sat there, quietly watching his empire fall apart. But the moment that stunned everyone came at the very end of the day. Just as the court was about to adjourn, Judge Harrison looked up and said, "Mr. Dalton, tomorrow you will take the stand." The room fell silent. Marshall blinked, caught off guard. His lawyer quickly leaned in to object, but Marshall stopped him. For the first time, he didn't want to hide. Maybe it was the pressure. Maybe it was the weight of the truth. But he nodded slowly. "I'll do it," he said. Judge Harrison nodded back, calm as ever. "Very well. Court will resume at 10 a.m. And just like that, she stood and walked out, her presence still filling the room even after she was gone. Marshall stayed seated, staring at the empty judge's bench. For the first time, he knew he couldn't talk or spend his way out of this. Tomorrow, he would have to speak, and whatever he said next might decide everything. The courtroom was packed the next morning. People had heard that Marshall Dalton, the arrogant billionaire who never admitted to anything, was finally going to speak. Reporters filled the back rows. The jury looked alert, and even the court officers seemed more focused than usual. There was a strange feeling in the air, like everyone was waiting for something big to happen. Marshall sat in the witness chair, wearing a dark suit and a nervous expression. He didn't look like the man who had walked into court a week ago full of pride and ego. Now he looked tired. His hands fidgeted slightly, and he kept glancing at the floor before meeting the judge's eyes. Judge Nyla Harrison gave him a slow, steady look. Then she nodded for the questioning to begin. The prosecutor stood up first. Her voice was calm but firm as she started. "Mr. Dalton, let's talk about the email you approved. The one that allowed an illegal purchase of protected land. Was that your signature?" Marshall took a breath. Everyone waited. He looked around for a second, as if searching for a way out, but there was none. He nodded slowly. "Yes," he said, his voice low. "That's my signature." A quiet murmur moved through the crowd. It was the first time Marshall had admitted to anything in public. Judge Harrison raised her hand slightly, and the room went silent again. The prosecutor continued. "And were you aware that this land was protected by law?" Marshall nodded again. "I was aware." His voice cracked a little, but he didn't stop. The questions kept coming, about money, about bribes, about false documents. Each time, Marshall answered honestly. It was like watching a dam break, one piece at a time. The man who had always acted untouchable was finally letting the truth out. By the time the prosecutor finished, Marshall looked drained. His eyes were dull, and he sat slumped in the chair, like a man who had run out of energy. Then came a surprise. Judge Harrison leaned forward and spoke directly to him. "Mr. Dalton," she said softly, "why now? Why tell the truth after all this time?" Marshall looked up at her. He paused, swallowed hard, and then answered. "Because I realized it's over. I thought I could win like I always did. I thought the rules didn't apply to me. But you showed me they do. I didn't respect this court. I didn't respect you. And I was wrong." The room was still. No one moved. Even the reporters had stopped writing. Judge Harrison studied him for a long moment. Then she leaned back and said, "Thank you for your honesty." No dramatic speeches, no big expressions, just a few simple words. But they carried weight. Marshall's lawyer didn't say much after that. There was nothing more to say. The jury had heard everything they needed to. Marshall had confessed, clearly and publicly. When the session ended, Marshall stood up slowly. As he walked back to his seat, he did something that shocked everyone. He turned to face Judge Harrison. For the first time in the entire trial, he bowed his head slightly in respect. Judge Harrison didn't smile, but she gave a small nod in return. Outside the courthouse, the news spread like wildfire. Headlines were already being written. Billionaire finally breaks silence, and Judge Harrison earns respect in historic courtroom moment. Inside the courtroom, though, things were quiet. The jury would return soon with their decision. But for now, Marshall Dalton had already experienced something he never thought possible. He had been humbled. And it wasn't by threats or force. It was by the calm, quiet strength of a judge who never raised her voice, but always stood her ground. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension. Everyone was back in their seats, waiting for the jury to return. It had been a long trial. 8 intense days of arguments, evidence, and surprises. But now, it was almost over. Marshall Dalton sat silently, his hands resting on the table in front of him. He wasn't fidgeting anymore. He just stared ahead, his face blank, as if he was already preparing himself for the worst. Judge Nyla Harrison entered the courtroom and took her seat. Her face was calm, as always. She gave a small nod to the bailiff, who then walked to the door and opened it. The jury began to file in, one by one, their faces serious. No one spoke. No one even coughed. The whole room seemed to be holding its breath. The jury foreperson stood up and handed a folded paper to the bailiff, who brought it over to Judge Harrison. She opened it, read it quickly, and then looked up. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" she asked. "Yes, Your Honor," the foreperson replied. "Please read the verdict." The foreperson took a deep breath and read clearly, "We, the jury, find the defendant, Marshall Dalton, guilty on all counts." A gasp rippled through the crowd. Marshall didn't move. He didn't even blink. He just sat there, staring ahead, like the words hadn't fully hit him yet. Judge Harrison nodded slowly. "Thank you. The court acknowledges the jury's decision." She turned her eyes to Marshall. "Mr. Dalton, you have been found guilty of multiple charges, including fraud, bribery, and environmental crimes. Sentencing will take place next week. Until then, you will remain in custody." Marshall's security officers quietly stepped forward. Marshall stood up without protest. He didn't argue. He didn't shout. He simply placed his hands behind his back as the cuffs were clicked into place. The arrogance, the pride, it was all gone now. As he was led away, he turned for one last look at Judge Harrison. She was already organizing her papers, focused and steady. She didn't gloat. She didn't show emotion. But something about her presence made that final look feel heavier. Outside the courthouse, crowds were gathering. The media rushed to report the outcome. Cameras flashed, and microphones were raised. But Judge Harrison didn't stop to speak. She walked out the side door with quiet dignity, just like she had walked in on the first day. People across the country started talking about what had happened. They talked about how a powerful billionaire was finally held accountable. They talked about how one judge, who many had underestimated because of her background, had stood firm and fair through it all. But most of all, they talked about how justice had been served, not through anger, not through shouting, but through truth, patience, and strength. Back in her chambers, Judge Harrison sat at her desk. She looked at the final notes from the case, then slowly closed the file. She wasn't the kind of person who celebrated wins. For her, it wasn't about beating someone powerful. It was about doing what was right. Meanwhile, Marshall sat alone in a holding cell. He thought about everything, his choices, his fall, and the quiet strength of the woman who had changed the course of his life. For the first time, he saw what real power looked like, and it wasn't money or fame. It was justice. And justice had a name: Judge Nella Harrison.